I never imagined that installing modern technology on my own property would turn me into a target. But the knock on my door proved I was wrong. Up until that moment, my life felt stable, predictable, and earned the old-fashioned American way. I'm Michael Carter, a homeowner, a father, and a man who believes that if you work hard, follow the rules, and mind your business, you deserve peace in your own home. This house wasn't inherited or handed down. I bought it after years of overtime, missed weekends, and careful saving, believing it would be the place where my family could finally breathe without interference. Like millions of Americans, my life changed when work moved inside the house. Remote meetings, late-night deadlines, and the need to protect my family pushed me towards smarter solutions. I wasn't chasing luxury or showing off. I was adapting. I installed solar panels to cut rising energy bills and do my part for the future. I added a smart doorbell and security cameras because safety isn't paranoia when you have kids sleeping under your roof. Technology wasn't a rebellion. It was a tool that helped me work better, live safer, and worry less every single day. When everything was installed, I stood in my driveway and felt proud. The panels sat clean and efficient on my roof. The cameras blended quietly into the corners of my home. The doorbell chimed softly through my phone like a promise that I was finally in control. This, to me, was the American dream evolving with the times. Progress didn't erase tradition. It protected it. I believed innovation was what kept this country strong, not something to be punished or feared. For a few weeks, life felt perfect. My energy bills dropped. My home office ran smoother. My family felt safer. Then the letters started. Polite at first, almost fake in their friendliness, reminding me about community aesthetics and unapproved modifications. Emails followed, dripping with passive-aggressive concern, warning me that my upgrades might set a precedent. I laughed it off, assuming logic would prevail. Surely no one would object to cleaner energy and better security. Surely common sense still existed behind the neatly trimmed lawns. But deep down, something felt off. The tone sharpened. The warnings grew bolder. It stopped sounding like guidance and started sounding like a threat. Still, I never expected a confrontation. I never expected authority to come knocking like an accusation. Yet one quiet afternoon, as sunlight hit the solar panels I was so proud of, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, the knock suddenly made sense. The woman standing there wasn't smiling. She wasn't curious. She looked ready for war. Linda Hawthorne didn't knock like a neighbor. She knocked like an executioner. She stood on my porch with perfect posture, manicured nails folded over a leather folder, and a smile that never reached her eyes. It was the kind of smile meant to remind you who held power, not to make you feel welcome. I knew instantly this wasn't a courtesy visit. This was a declaration. She introduced herself slowly, clearly enjoying the moment. Linda Hawthorne, HOA president, she said, as if the title alone should make me stand straighter. Her voice was calm, polished, and dripping with practiced authority. She scanned my home, her eyes lingering on the solar panels, the discreet camera near the garage, the smart doorbell she had just used. I didn't miss the slight curl of disapproval on her lips. To her, my house wasn't a home. It was a problem waiting to be corrected. Linda had a way of speaking that felt rehearsed, like she'd memorized every line in advance. She wasn't loud or aggressive. She didn't need to be. Power hummed beneath every word. She explained that my recent technological additions were raising concerns within the community. The way she said community made it sound like a fragile antique I had recklessly handled with dirty hands. According to her, my upgrades violated community standards, a phrase she repeated like a legal spell. I asked her which rule I had broken. Calmly, respectfully. I even smiled, trying to keep the conversation neighborly. That's when her tone shifted. She opened the folder and began quoting bylaws written decades ago, referencing language about visual uniformity and architectural harmony. She spoke as if time had frozen some time before smartphones, solar energy, or remote work existed. To Linda, progress wasn't evolution, it was disobedience. I tried to explain why I installed the technology. I talked about energy efficiency, about safety, about how millions of Americans work from home now. I reminded her that nothing I'd added was loud, disruptive, or visible from the street in any offensive way. I even mentioned property values, thinking that might reach her. She listened, nodding occasionally, but her eyes told a different story. She wasn't considering my words. She was waiting for me to stop talking. When she finally responded, it was with a tight smile and a firm shake of her head. She said the HOA was not responsible for keeping up with trends. She said rules were rules, regardless of modern conveniences. The word conveniences stung. Protecting my family wasn't convenience. Saving money and energy wasn't vanity. But to her, reality itself was optional, as long as authority stayed intact. Standing there, I felt the imbalance clearly. She had an HOA board behind her, legal language, and the power to fine me. I had logic, common sense, and the belief that homeowners deserved a voice. That belief suddenly felt small under her shadow. She closed the folder with a soft snap, like a judge ending a hearing. Before turning away, she looked directly at me and delivered her final sentence with chilling calm. "You'll be hearing from us formally." As she walked back down my driveway, that sense of pride I'd felt just days earlier began to crack, and I knew this was only the beginning. Before I could even defend myself, the punishment was already decided. Less than 24 hours after Linda Hawthorne walked off my driveway, I opened my mailbox and felt my stomach drop. Inside was a thick envelope stamped with the HOA logo, the kind of envelope that never carries good news. It wasn't a follow-up, and it certainly wasn't an invitation to talk things through. It was an official violation notice, cold and formal, as if my side of the story had never existed at all. The letter laid everything out with ruthless efficiency. I was being fined for unauthorized exterior modifications, a phrase vague enough to mean whatever Linda wanted it to mean. There was a breakdown of penalties, each line more insulting than the last. A daily fine that would continue to grow until compliance. An administrative fee for review. A deadline that gave me less than 2 weeks to remove the technology or face further action. No warning, no hearing, no opportunity to respond before judgment was passed. I stood there rereading the letter, trying to make sense of how quickly everything had escalated. Disbelief washed over me first, followed by anger so sharp it made my hands shake. I had followed the rules as I understood them. I had paid my dues on time, attended meetings when I could, and kept my property immaculate. Yet here I was, branded as a violator without a single chance to explain myself. It felt humiliating, like being scolded in public for a crime you didn't commit. What hurt the most wasn't even the money, though the fines were steep enough to sting. It was the speed. Linda hadn't consulted the board in good faith. She hadn't asked for homeowner input. She hadn't even waited a full day. The conversation on my porch had barely ended before the machinery of punishment was already in motion. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about maintaining standards. This was about proving she could act without resistance. I read the letter again more slowly, searching for any mention of appeal or discussion. There was none. Just instructions. Remove the technology. Pay the fines. Comply. The language was deliberate, designed to make resistance feel pointless. It stripped me of my voice and reduced me to a line item on a violation report. For the first time since buying my home, I felt small inside my own walls. Anger gave way to clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be solved with a conversation. This was a power move. Linda was sending a message, not just to me, but to every homeowner watching quietly from behind their curtains. Step out of line, even unintentionally, and the hammer falls fast. Rules were just the excuse. Control was the goal. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the kitchen counter, staring at it like it might change if I looked long enough. That's when I noticed the final paragraph, buried beneath the fines and deadlines. One sentence, casually written, that shifted everything. It mentioned further enforcement measures if I failed to comply, measures that went far beyond fines. And in that moment, I realized the real threat hadn't even begun yet. When they threatened liens and foreclosure, I knew this was no longer small. I reread the violation notice late that night, sitting at the kitchen table while the house slept, and that's when the words finally sank in. If I failed to comply, the HOA reserved the right to pursue legal action, liens, collections, even foreclosure, all of it spelled out in neat, impersonal language, over a doorbell camera and a few panels on my roof. My home, the one place I thought was untouchable, suddenly felt fragile. Fear crept in quietly, the kind that doesn't announce itself but settles deep in your chest. I thought about my kids asleep down the hall, about the stability I promised them when we moved in. This house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was security, routine, and the proof that hard work could still buy peace. The idea that an HOA could threaten all of that over technology meant to protect us felt surreal, almost absurd, if it wasn't so real. The irony was impossible to ignore. I was being punished for improving safety, for lowering energy costs, for doing exactly what responsible homeowners are encouraged to do. The camera they objected to was the same one that let me check who rang the bell when I was working late. The solar panels they hated were the reason my utility bills stopped climbing every month. Somehow progress had been rebranded as defiance, and I was paying the price. Word traveled fast, even if no one spoke openly. Neighbors started stopping me during walks, lowering their voices like we were discussing something forbidden. A couple admitted they'd wanted solar panels for years but were too afraid to try. Others said they'd received warnings for smaller things and backed down immediately. No one wanted to be the next target. Linda's authority had created a neighborhood of quiet compliance, and now I understood why no one challenged her. Meanwhile, Linda's tone changed completely. The emails grew sharper, more confident. She stopped pretending this was about standards and started acting like enforcement was a personal victory. Every message carried an edge of arrogance, as if she enjoyed reminding me how much power she held. She didn't ask if I planned to comply. She told me what would happen if I didn't. The woman who smiled on my porch now spoke like someone who knew the system would protect her no matter how unreasonable she became. Inside, I was torn. Part of me wanted to rip everything down, pay the fine and make it stop. Compliance would be easier, quieter, safer. But every time I imagined doing that, something tightened in my chest. If I backed down now, what would stop them from coming after the next homeowner? Or me again? This wasn't just about technology anymore. It was about whether authority could reach into my home and dictate reality without question. I sat alone that night, staring at the violation notice and listening to the hum of the house I'd worked so hard to build. Fear and anger wrestled inside me, but one truth became clear. If I gave in, I'd never feel secure here again. And as the clock crept past midnight, I made a decision that would change everything. A decision I knew I couldn't undo. If they were going to use the rules against me, I'd learn every word of them. That decision settled in the moment I realized fear was exactly what the HOA relied on. Late that night, after the house went quiet again, I pulled out the thick binder of HOA bylaws I'd barely touched since closing day. It felt heavy in my hands, not just in weight, but in implication. This document had been used to intimidate, fine, and threaten my home. If I was going to fight back, it had to start here. Night after night, I sat at the kitchen table, coffee going cold beside me, reading line after line of dense, outdated language. The bylaws felt like they were written for a different century. They talked about satellite dishes the size of trash can lids, visible antennas, and exterior add-ons that disrupted uniformity, but nothing about smart devices, security cameras, or renewable energy. The more I read, the more I realized how much interpretation was being used as a weapon. The language was vague on purpose. Phrases like architectural harmony and community aesthetics appeared over and over, never clearly defined, never updated. There were no diagrams, no modern examples, no measurable standards. It gave the HOA enormous flexibility, and homeowners almost none. Linda wasn't enforcing clear rules. She was bending gray areas until they snapped in her favor. Then I started noticing contradictions. One section encouraged energy efficiency and responsible homeownership. Another praised modernization as long as it didn't materially disrupt the neighborhood. Yet nowhere did it explain who decided what disrupt meant. Even more telling, there was a clause stating that any restriction not explicitly listed could not be arbitrarily enforced. I reread that line 3 times just to be sure my exhaustion wasn't playing tricks on me. That's when something shifted. For the first time since Linda walked onto my porch, I felt a spark of hope. Technology wasn't explicitly banned. Solar panels weren't prohibited. Security cameras weren't mentioned at all. Everything she accused me of violating existed only through her interpretation, not the written rules themselves. The fear that had been sitting on my chest began to loosen its grip, replaced by a cautious sense of clarity. I printed sections, highlighted lines, and took notes like I was preparing for an exam. Each page chipped away at the narrative Linda had built. The more I learned, the more obvious it became that most homeowners never challenged her simply because they never read this far. The rules looked intimidating at a glance, but under scrutiny, they were fragile, outdated, full of holes. Then I found it. Buried deep in the enforcement section was a clause about due process. It stated that homeowners were entitled to notice, an opportunity to be heard, and a fair review before penalties were finalized. My fine had arrived before any hearing, before any vote, before any real discussion. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding, staring at that sentence. That clause didn't just give me hope, it gave me leverage. And I knew the moment Linda realized I'd found it, everything was about to change. The moment I challenged her authority, she showed her true face. The HOA meeting was held in the same bland community room it always was, folding chairs lined up beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired before they even spoke. I walked in with my notes neatly organized, highlighted bylaws tucked under my arm, and a calm resolve I had worked hard to build. I wasn't there to yell. I wasn't there to disrupt. I was there to ask questions, the kind Linda never expected anyone to ask. Linda sat at the front like she owned the air in the room, gavel resting beside her hand, even though no one had officially called the meeting to order yet. When my turn came to speak, I stood and introduced myself, explaining that I had received fines without due process and wanted clarification. I hadn't even finished my first sentence before she cut me off. Sharp, immediate. She said the matter was already resolved and not open for discussion. The room went quiet in a way that felt rehearsed. I tried again, calmly referencing the clause I had found about homeowner hearings. This time, she laughed, not loudly, but dismissively, and said I was misinterpreting legal language. She spoke over me, louder now, reframing my concerns as complaints, my questions as disruptions. Every time I opened my mouth, she interrupted, reminding everyone that meetings were not personal soapboxes. It wasn't debate, it was domination. Then came the public shaming. Linda suggested that my upgrades were selfish, that I was thinking only of myself instead of the community. She implied I was setting a dangerous example, pushing boundaries others had respectfully accepted. I felt dozens of eyes on me, neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke up, not because they agreed with her, but because they were afraid of becoming the next example. I looked around the room and saw it clearly. These were good people, families, retirees, working parents, all watching in silence as one person decided what was acceptable reality. Their silence wasn't approval, it was survival, and that realization hardened something inside me. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about a system that punished curiosity and rewarded obedience. Linda sensed the shift and leaned into her power even harder. She declared the discussion closed and moved on to the next agenda item without a vote, without acknowledgement, without fairness. That's when she made her mistake. As she spoke, she referenced enforcement actions that hadn't yet been approved by the board. She admitted, casually, that she had already authorized penalties before the meeting even took place. The words hung in the air. A few heads lifted. Few brows furrowed. I felt it. The moment control slipped just enough for doubt to creep in. I didn't interrupt her this time. I let her talk. Let her confirm what I already knew. When she finally stopped, the silence felt different. Heavier. Charged. I sat back down, heart pounding but steady. She thought she had shut me down. What she didn't realize was that in front of everyone, she had just proven exactly what I needed. What I uncovered wasn't just unfair. It was illegal. After that meeting, I stopped hoping the system would correct itself and started documenting everything. I requested meeting minutes, enforcement records, and voting logs the HOA was legally required to provide. The responses came slowly and reluctantly, as if Linda believed delay itself could erase truth. But every document that landed in my hands told the same story, and it was uglier than I expected. The votes didn't add up. Actions that required board approval had been recorded as unanimous, without dates, names, or signatures. Some meetings listed decisions that never appeared on any agenda. Others showed votes taken before discussions ever happened. The more I compared documents, the clearer it became that outcomes were decided first, and paperwork was filled in later to justify them. My fines weren't the result of a vote. They were the result of Linda's will. Emails confirmed what the minutes tried to hide. I found messages where Linda instructed board members to confirm enforcement actions retroactively. She framed it as efficiency, but the language was unmistakable. She wasn't asking for approval. She was directing compliance. One email even referenced my property specifically, dated before the meeting, where she claimed the issue was discussed. Reading that line made my jaw tighten. She hadn't just silenced me. She'd erased me from the process entirely. As I dug deeper, a pattern emerged. I wasn't the first. There were other homeowners, smaller disputes, similar tactics, fines issued without hearings, warnings escalated without votes. Linda's name appeared on every enforcement decision, always ahead of schedule, always confident no one would challenge her. Authority had turned into habit, and habit had turned into abuse. That's when I knew I couldn't do this alone. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, bringing a folder so thick it barely closed. As I laid everything out, the bylaws, the emails, the timelines, I watched his expression change. He didn't interrupt. He didn't downplay it. When I finished, he leaned back and said the words that shifted everything. This isn't just misconduct. This is a violation of due process. Hearing that felt like validation and warning all at once. He explained that HOAs have power, but only when they follow their own rules and state law. Retroactive votes, fabricated minutes, and unilateral enforcement weren't gray areas. They were legal liabilities. The fines, the threats, the intimidation tactics all pointed to a case that could stand up in court. For the first time, the weight of what I was facing felt balanced by the weight of the truth. Filing the lawsuit wasn't an emotional decision. It was deliberate, calculated, and necessary. The moment the paperwork was served, everything changed. Emails from Linda stopped overnight. The confident tone disappeared. In its place came frantic calls from the HOA's legal counsel asking for extensions and clarification. Linda, the woman who once dismissed my questions with a smile, suddenly wanted everything handled amicably. I didn't respond. I let the process speak for itself. Because once the lawsuit was filed, Linda finally understood something she never had before. This wasn't a homeowner she could intimidate. This was a record she couldn't rewrite. And somewhere between the courtroom filings and the silence from her office, I realized she was panicking, and that meant I was finally being heard. The courtroom felt colder than any HOA meeting, but it was my chance. As I walked through the metal detector and into the quiet hall, The weight of everything I'd been carrying finally settled into something sharper than fear. This wasn't my driveway. This wasn't a community room with folding chairs and an unchallenged gavel. This was neutral ground. For the first time since this ordeal began, Linda Hawthorne didn't control the room. She arrived with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Perfect suit, tight smile, chin lifted just enough to signal she still believed she was untouchable. She barely looked at me as she took her seat, surrounded by paperwork that seemed more decorative than necessary. To her, this was just another place to perform authority. I could tell she expected the same results she always got. Obedience, dismissal, silence. The judge entered without ceremony and the room shifted instantly. No smile, no impatience, just calm focus. He didn't care about personalities or titles. He cared about facts. That alone felt like a victory. When he spoke, it was measured and direct, setting the tone immediately. This wasn't about emotions. This was about whether power had been abused under the cover of rules. When it was my turn, my attorney and I presented the evidence piece by piece. Emails showing enforcement decisions made before votes. Meeting minutes that contradicted timestamps. Bylaws highlighting due process requirements that were ignored entirely. As each document was introduced, I watched Linda's posture stiffen. The confidence she walked in with started to crack, replaced by tension she couldn't smooth away. The HOA's arguments came next, and they were painfully thin. Their attorney leaned heavily on vague language about community standards and board discretion, repeating phrases without grounding them in facts. They talked about aesthetics, tradition, and precedent, but avoided timelines and documentation. When pressed about why no hearing occurred before fines were issued, the answers grew circular. When asked about retroactive votes, the explanations became evasive. What struck me most was how little technology actually mattered in that room. Solar panels, cameras, smart devices, they were barely discussed. This wasn't a debate about modernization. It was about whether rules could be bent to punish a homeowner without process. The judge seemed to understand that immediately. He asked clarifying questions, not about how my home looked, but about how decisions were made. Linda tried to interject more than once, correcting her attorney, insisting the board acted in good faith. Each time, the judge shut it down calmly, reminding her to speak through counsel. Watching that happen was surreal. The woman who once cut me off mid-sentence couldn't interrupt here. Her authority ended at the bench. As the hearing progressed, the judge flipped through the evidence quietly, occasionally making notes. The room felt heavy, every sound amplified. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, not from panic, but from anticipation. This was the first time the full story was being told without interruption. Then it happened. The judge looked up, directly at Linda, and asked a single question that froze the room. He asked how a homeowner could be fined and threatened with foreclosure without being given an opportunity to be heard, when the HOA's own bylaws explicitly required it. No accusation, no raised voice, just a question rooted in reality. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. Her attorney scrambled for an answer, offering explanations that didn't quite fit. The judge waited, patient and unmoved. In that silence, I felt something shift. This wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about accountability. And as the judge leaned back in his chair, still holding those bylaws in his hand, I knew that one question had changed everything. The courtroom went silent, and Linda had no answer. The judge leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the open binder of HOA bylaws as if he were weighing their age as much as their meaning. His eyes moved from the page to Linda, then briefly to the exhibits showing timestamps, emails, and enforcement notices that told a very modern story. When he spoke again, his tone wasn't sarcastic or cruel. It was curious, almost incredulous. He asked whether the HOA believed the world had somehow stopped evolving. He questioned how rules written decades ago, never updated, could be applied rigidly to a homeowner living in a reality filled with remote work, smart security, and renewable energy. Then he said it plainly, in words that felt like air rushing back into the room. Whether expecting homeowners to live by standards frozen in the past was reasonable or lawful. Linda shifted in her chair. The confident posture she'd maintained all morning finally broke. Her hands tightened together, knuckles whitening, as her attorney attempted to respond. He spoke about tradition, about preserving neighborhood character, about consistency. But the judge wasn't focused on nostalgia. He was focused on logic. He interrupted gently, asking how character was harmed by safety measures that didn't disrupt neighbors or violate explicit rules. The judge went further. He referenced case law, decisions where courts had ruled that HOAs could not arbitrarily enforce vague standards to block technological progress. He spoke about homeowners' rights to reasonable use of their property, especially when improvements serve safety, efficiency, and modern necessity. Each precedent he mentioned felt like another crack forming in the wall Linda had built around herself for years. As the discussion continued, Linda's unraveling became visible. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering urgently, her composure slipping. Her polished calm was gone, replaced by frustration she could no longer hide. The judge noticed. He asked her directly whether the HOA had ever updated its guidelines to reflect modern living, whether homeowners had been given clear notice of what was and wasn't allowed in the age of smart technology. She hesitated, then offered a vague answer about board discretion. The judge nodded slowly, then asked how discretion could replace written standards without becoming arbitrary. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost uncomfortable. Linda looked down at her papers, avoiding eye contact. For the first time, she looked small. What struck me most was how the room had shifted. This wasn't me versus the HOA anymore. This was reality versus denial. The judge acknowledged openly that communities evolve, that laws and agreements must be interpreted in good faith, not weaponized to maintain control. He emphasized that rules exist to serve people, not to trap them. Linda tried one last time to assert authority, mentioning the need for uniformity. The judge responded calmly, asking whether uniformity meant stagnation. He pointed out that technology had become part of everyday life, not a luxury or a threat. Expecting homeowners to pretend otherwise, he said, wasn't reasonable governance. I watched Linda's face tighten as she realized what was happening. The confidence she once wielded so effortlessly was gone, replaced by a dawning awareness that this wasn't a room she could dominate. The power imbalance she relied on had vanished under scrutiny. Here, titles didn't matter. Only fairness did. The judge closed the binder slowly and looked at both sides. He said he'd heard enough and would issue a ruling. My heart pounded, not from fear this time, but from anticipation. Linda sat frozen, staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched. As the judge gathered his notes and prepared to speak, the courtroom held its breath. The verdict was moments away, and I knew whatever came next would change far more than just my case. When the judge spoke, it felt like freedom being restored. His voice was calm, steady, and unmistakably firm, the kind of tone that leaves no room for reinterpretation later. He didn't rush. He didn't dramatize. He simply laid out the truth piece by piece as if restoring order where it had been deliberately bent. From the very first sentence, I knew this wasn't going to end the way Linda expected. He ruled clearly and decisively in my favor. The fines were invalid, he said, because they were issued without due process. The enforcement actions were improper because they were authorized before any legitimate board review. The threats of lines and foreclosure, he added, were not only premature, but dangerously irresponsible. Hearing those words out loud felt unreal. For months, those threats had hovered over my family like a storm cloud, and now they were being dismantled in real time. The judge went further. He ordered the HOA to immediately rescind all fines and penalties associated with my home upgrades. Any record of violation was to be removed. Any accrued fees were void. The relief hit me in waves, each sentence lifting a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. This wasn't a partial win or a technical escape. It was a complete rejection of how the HOA had treated me. Then came the part Linda wasn't prepared for. The judge addressed the HOA leadership directly, and his words carried the kind of authority she'd spent years mimicking but never truly held. He criticized the board's failure to follow its own governing documents. He called out the misuse of vague language to justify unilateral decisions. He warned that HOAs exist to manage communities, not intimidate them, and that any future conduct like this could result in far more serious consequences. I glanced at Linda as he spoke. Her face was tight, color drained, eyes fixed forward as if she could will herself invisible. This wasn't the controlled environment she thrived in. This was accountability. Public, documented, and impossible to spin. Every word from the bench stripped away the illusion of unquestioned authority she had built. The judge also made something else clear, something that felt bigger than my case alone. He reaffirmed that homeowners have rights, even within an HOA. Rights to notice, rights to be heard, rights to make reasonable improvements to their property when those improvements don't violate explicit lawful restrictions. He said progress itself is not a violation, and that rules cannot be used as weapons against reality. Sitting there, I felt something close to vindication, but deeper. This wasn't about proving I was right. It was about proving that fear shouldn't be the price of home ownership. That silence shouldn't be mistaken for consent. That power, when left unchecked, will always overreach, unless someone forces it into the light. As the judge concluded, he reminded the HOA that the court would retain jurisdiction should further disputes arise. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. One Linda understood all too well. When court adjourned, the room shifted again. People stood, papers shuffled. Conversations started quietly, but Linda didn't move right away. She sat there rigid, absorbing the reality she could no longer deny. I walked out of that courtroom feeling lighter than I had in months. Justice hadn't been loud or dramatic. It had been steady and grounded, rooted in facts and fairness. For the first time since that knock on my door, my home felt like mine again. But as I stepped into the hallway, I caught a glimpse of Linda speaking urgently to her attorney, her expression no longer defeated, but calculating. The case was over, yes, but the woman who built her identity on control wasn't finished yet. The woman who ruled through fear lost everything she controlled. The shift didn't happen slowly, and it didn't happen quietly. It happened the moment the court ruling became public. By the next morning, the neighborhood felt different, like a long-held breath had finally been released. People who used to look down or hurry past each other stopped to talk. Driveway conversations stretched longer. Doors opened. And for the first time in years, Linda Hawthorne's name was being spoken without whispers. The backlash came fast. Emails flooded the HOA inbox demanding explanations, audits, and copies of enforcement records. Homeowners who had paid fines without question suddenly wanted refunds. Others asked why they'd never been given hearings. Some openly questioned whether previous votes had ever been legitimate at all. The same people who once stayed silent now had a court ruling in hand, and it gave them courage Linda had spent years crushing. Linda tried to maintain control at first. She sent a carefully worded message claiming the ruling was misunderstood, and that the board would review procedures. But the tone didn't work anymore. Her authority had been stripped of its mystery. Without fear, her words sounded hollow. Board members who once nodded along began asking their own questions, distancing themselves from decisions they'd quietly allowed her to make alone. Within days, an emergency HOA meeting was called. This time, the room was full. People stood along the walls, arms crossed, voices ready. Linda sat at the front, but the posture was gone. No gavel, no commanding presence. When homeowners spoke, she didn't interrupt. She couldn't. The court had made it clear. And everyone knew it. One by one, neighbors shared their stories. Fines issued without warning. Requests denied without explanation. Fear of retaliation if they spoke up. The pattern was undeniable. What I'd faced wasn't an isolated incident. It was a system. And now that system was being dismantled in public view. By the end of that meeting, Linda resigned. There was no dramatic speech, no apology. just a short statement about stepping down in the best interest of the community. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who once defined the community by control had lost it completely. She left the room without making eye contact. Her power gone the moment people stopped believing in it. What followed wasn't chaos, it was reform. A temporary committee was formed to review bylaws, enforcement practices, and voting procedures. Homeowners volunteered. Lawyers were consulted. Transparency became more than a buzzword. It became a demand. Rules were rewritten in plain language. Due process was spelled out clearly. Technology and modernization were acknowledged, not feared. Neighbors who had never spoken at meetings before started showing up regularly. People who once felt alone realized they never were. The atmosphere shifted from compliance to participation. This wasn't about revenge. It was about rebuilding trust in a place that was supposed to feel like home. I watched it all with a strange mix of relief and responsibility. I hadn't planned to become the spark for change. I just wanted to protect my family and my home. But standing up had done more than stop one abuse of power. It had reminded an entire neighborhood that authority only works when people allow it to go unquestioned. As weeks passed, the community began to heal. There were still disagreements, still debates, but they were open now, honest, grounded in respect instead of fear. And every time I walked past my house, solar panels catching the sun, doorbell camera quietly doing its job, I felt something I hadn't felt since before all of this began. The neighborhood wasn't the same anymore, and this time that change felt like progress. What started as a doorbell upgrade became a fight for freedom. Standing in my driveway now, I sometimes think back to how small this all seemed at the beginning. A practical decision. A modern upgrade. Something millions of Americans do every year without a second thought. I never set out to challenge authority or expose corruption. I just wanted to live responsibly in the home I worked my life to earn. Yet that simple desire pulled back a curtain I didn't even know was there. Looking back, the journey feels surreal. From that first knock on my door to the courtroom ruling, every step forced me to confront a truth many homeowners quietly live with. Power goes unchecked when people are too afraid or too tired to question it. I learned quickly that silence is often mistaken for agreement, and compliance is often confused with fairness. The HOA relied on that confusion. Linda thrived on it, and for a long time, it worked. The hardest lesson was realizing that standing up doesn't feel heroic when you're in it. It feels lonely. It feels risky. There were nights I questioned myself, wondering if peace was worth more than principle. But each time I thought about backing down, I imagined explaining it to my kids someday. Explaining why I let fear dictate what was acceptable in our own home. That thought always brought me back. Technology, in the end, was never the enemy. It was the excuse. Progress scares people who depend on control, because progress exposes how fragile that control really is. Solar panels, security cameras, smart devices, they aren't rebellion. They're reflections of how life actually works now. Fighting them isn't about preserving values. It's about refusing to accept reality. And no rule, no matter how old or vaguely written, should be used to punish people for living responsibly in the present. What changed everything wasn't just the court ruling. It was what came after. Watching neighbors find their voices. Seeing rules rewritten with clarity instead of intimidation. Experiencing what a community looks like when participation replaces fear. I didn't win alone. We all did. The moment people realized they weren't powerless, they were just untested. I also learned that authority demands accountability the moment it's challenged with facts instead of emotion. Linda's power didn't disappear because she was loud or cruel. It disappeared because it couldn't survive scrutiny. That's a lesson that reaches far beyond one HOA. Systems only stay broken when people believe they can't be fixed. Today, my home feels different again, but not because anything was removed. It feels different because it's truly mine. Not just on paper, not just through a mortgage statement, but in practice. I no longer wonder if a letter in my mailbox will threaten my family's stability. I no longer feel like I have to ask permission to live sensibly. That peace was worth every uncomfortable moment it took to get here. If there's one thing I hope this journey leaves behind, it's confidence. Confidence that rules can be questioned. Confidence that fairness still matters. Confidence that one person, armed with patience and truth, can change more than just their own outcome. I didn't just protect my home. I helped return the HOA to what it was always supposed to be. A service to the community, not a weapon against it. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it just waits for someone willing to push back. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, punished for progress, or silenced for standing up, share this story. Subscribe, comment, and remind others that your home is your freedom.